All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, folks. I'm Marty Matlock. You folks are all muted at this point just so we don't have the sort of unnecessary background noise as we talk, but we certainly welcome you to this webinar, this review of the National Roundtable for Sustainable Agriculture's workshop number 1. I'm Marty Matlock. I'm the Executive Director of the Office for Sustainability and a Professor of Bio and Ag Engineering at the University of Arkansas. This workshop summary was an outcome of a workshop that was held in concert with the NIAA National Institute for Animal Agriculture meeting in Indianapolis, Indiana. Those of you who are online should be able to see the first slide. I did email to all the registered participants the PDF of all of these slides as well. So I will tell you which slide we're on for those of you who are only on the phone but not on a computer but may have the slides up on a remote PC. If you would like copies of the slides as a PowerPoint, let me know. I'll have to take the pictures off because the pictures are too big, but the rest of the information certainly will transfer. So you should have my email contact. It's mmatlock@uark.edu if you have any troubles. We're going to go ahead and proceed with our agenda, roughly 20 minutes of presentation just to review. Then we'll have roughly 10 minutes of question and answer from the participants in the workshop. And those of you who weren't able to participate in the workshop will be able to hopefully glean some clarity from if you have questions, and then we'll open it up to the general floor. So that's our format. We'll spend an hour together, and I'm certainly available for folks if you want to spend more time or if you have further questions down the road. The whole purpose of this webinar is to explain and describe what we're up to. There's also a report of the workshop, a document that's part of the handouts as part of the workshop. So we'll move to slide 2. Just to give you context, I've been working with ag sustainability programs around the world. In the United States, I work with a number of agricultural initiatives. You see them on the slide. And we're at various stages of development and implementation of this continuous improvement framework. One of the, so moving to slide 3, one of the, in my opinion, most successful multi-stakeholder initiatives in agriculture to date in the world is the Field to Market Alliance for Sustainable Agriculture. This is an organization that was formed about 9 years ago now as a collaborative between conservation organizations, agricultural producers, supply chain folks, the suppliers to the agricultural producers, customers to the agricultural products, and consumers and consumer representatives to try to understand what the challenges of sustainability are and how best to prioritize our limited resources to make things better, to address those challenges. So much of the work that we have subsequently engaged in is informed by this multi-stakeholder initiative. I'm on the board of directors for Field to Market, but it's again, it's representative of a number of institutional and organizational priorities, including agricultural producers, predominantly row crop. Agricultural animal producers are currently developing strategies aligned with this approach as well. So we're trying to develop a common framework for sustainable agriculture, and that framework that we're going to be presenting today, which is part of the implementation of the Roundtable for Sustainable Aquaculture, is being drafted right now as an ANSI standard, American National Standards Institute standard, by American Society of Ag and Biological Engineers. We were in New Orleans this week. Tuesday evening, the technical committee responsible for developing standards we received revisions and comments from at large, and we incorporated those comments, and now we're going back out for another round of votes within the community and within the committee as this moves forward as an ANSI standard. What that means is those agricultural communities that are, or organizations that are using this framework will be able to reference this standard. And that's an important element because it gives us commonality. These are all volunteer standards. This is not a certification protocol. We do not certify anybody. These are standards so that if you say you're using what will be perhaps ANSI 629, everyone who uses ANSI 629 knows the language and knows what you're talking about. This is ultimately the framework. On slide 5 now. Sustainability is continuous improvement. Define, plan, and implement. In an earlier version, we had define, measure, and implement, item 2, but Now we've subsequently felt that plan was probably better than, more descriptive than measure. So we define sustainability for the enterprise, define key performance indicators, and then select metrics for those key performance indicators. Then you plan, you benchmark those key performance indicators, figure out where you are now, set goals for them, develop strategies to meet the goals. Then you implement the strategy, measure and assess and report outcomes, adapt strategy to improve the outcomes, and iterate. And that is the process of continuous improvement. Define, plan, and implement, and the process of iteration is if you're meeting your goals, if you're on target and your goals are making things better, whatever those goals are, keep going. If, though, you're not meeting your goals or situation has changed and the goals need to be reprioritized, go back to step 2 and evaluate and start over. We don't start over, but you clarify and improve. If it's not working, stop doing it and do something else. Those are some of the foundational criteria for continuous improvement. By the way, back up to slide 5. At the workshop number 1 in Minneapolis, or I'm sorry, in Indianapolis, with NIAA in last March, we focused on step 1, define. And so we spent a significant amount of time defining sustainability and the key performance indicators, and then exploring metrics for those. And we'll talk about that outcome in just a moment. Some criteria for key performance indicators, and this is definitionally important. Key performance indicators are the things we measure to inform decisions. They're the things we care about. In our daily lives, there are thousands of indicators we deal with. The key ones are the important ones for informing a specific set of decisions. They should be outcomes-based. That is, in sustainability, we're trying to make something better. They should be science-driven. There are a number of ways of understanding the world, cultural, spiritual, but for the physical and biological and ecological processes we're managing, science is the way we're using to understand these processes. They should be technology neutral, and they should be transparent. That is, they should not be dictating a technology. The outcomes should drive the decision making, but everyone should know what we're doing in these key performance indicators. Example key performance indicators for environmental domains are, of course, the standard greenhouse gas. If you're in agricultural production, soil loss, energy use, water use, land use, water quality, nutrient use efficiency, habitat and biodiversity. These are examples of environmental KPIs. We also need to be considering social and economic KPIs. Those are the 3 domains of sustainability. These environmental KPIs are commonly adopted across a number of initiatives: commodity crops, pork, poultry, beef, potentially, and perhaps aquaculture. The goals that should be set, however, should be set from an aspirational and strategic perspective by the organization. And part of the protocol is that tactical and operational goals that are management decisions, how to achieve the outcomes that you desire, belong to the enterprise, not to the multi-stakeholder group. The process is not about dictating performance practices. The process is about dictating performance outcomes. And when I say dictating, I really mean identifying our priorities and trying to achieve goals in those outcomes. Those outcomes are the key criteria for assessing our success or failure in making progress towards becoming more sustainable. As an example, U.S. soybean producers this year adopted goals for land use, soil erosion, energy use, and greenhouse gas emissions, where they are committing to reducing their land use by 10%, which means increasing yield, reducing soil erosion 25% in tons per bushel. That's an efficiency measurement. Increasing energy use efficiency by 10% across all U.S. soybean producers per year, and decreasing greenhouse gas emissions by 10% across all U.S. soybean producers per year. The first workshop, the National Roundtable for Sustainable Aquaculture workshop, met in Indianapolis, as we indicated. We had a half-day set of presentations, and we had a full day of stakeholder engagement. There are 52 folks in the room representing 7 supply chain sectors. So we had industry groups, public institutions, retail or technology providers, feed providers, a couple of growers, a couple of academic institutions, a couple of conservation organizations, and we did not have manufacturer processors or retailers, and that was one of our challenges. That's something we hope to remedy in the future. Slussi et al. In 2012 published a paper on sustainable seafood as a journey, not an endpoint, and that's something that I think is critical to understand. We are always about getting better. We're never done. We don't become sustainable. We become more sustainable over time. So sustainability is the mechanism or method by which we get better. It's the process. It's not the endpoint. It's the journey. It's not the destination. The workshop goals were deliberation and decisions. Deliberation for to articulate a range of sustainability concerns, and decisions to identify priorities and key performance indicators. I'm on slide 13 for those following along.
Thank you.
I'm hearing an echo. If those of you on the phone could mute your phone so I don't echo back. It's a chronic problem on these webinars, sorry. So we use this rapid deliberation process. Those of you who are in the room at the end of 8 hours, we were all exhausted, but there was a sense that it went too fast. That's good because it meant we kept moving. We didn't get stuck. Now, that's not because we were afraid to deliberate at length and discuss issues, but the point is that when you're together, you make the decisions you can make, and you set aside the decisions that are going to take more time, and then you take more time with those. But while you're together, you make progress on what you agree on, and that's the part of the rapid deliberation process. We started with priority issues on slide 15, priority issues across dimensions of sustainability, social, environmental, and economic. We organized by tables. Every table in the room, there were about, I think, 12 tables, identified, and the tables were composed of mixed groups, and they identified their top priorities, and they stuck them to the wall. So this is a standard process you guys are probably all familiar with. And then in this way, we use these standard color-coded sticky notes, but what we were able to do then is identify a materiality matrix where we looked at the producer priorities from low, medium to high with the customer, consumer, and non-government organization priorities from low, medium to high across all three domains, social, economic, and environmental dimensions of sustainability. And we ended up with a number of panels that looked like this, where we had a number of decisions, and of course the high priorities are critical for everybody, but this allowed us to start prioritizing. And you see the sticky notes in this slide 16 are doubled up a little bit. That's because many folks had the same concerns, and so you had 5 or 6 concerns that were the same, so this is the point of aggregation. And you see what the room looked like now on slide 17, where we had all of these, we had the wall papered with these materiality matrix issues. And that's the process by which we discussed values. So that's when everyone in the room got to say, no, I think it's a higher priority, that's probably a medium priority, and where different sectors got to articulate their values relative to the producer's values. So it was an incredibly powerful process for just communicating and understanding, let alone decision making. I didn't invent this process, by the way. It's a fairly well-established process for decision making. And so what we developed on slide 18 are economic, social, and environmental priorities, priority issues. These are not necessarily key performance indicators yet, but they are the priority issues for each dimension. Consumer value, marketing, cost of production, access to capital, government regulations on economic, farm raised, consumer understanding, product quality, food safety, affordability on social, risk of disease, sustainability of feed sources, water quality, efficiency of resource use, environmental regulations on environmental issues. Now, we then evaluated how measurable things, the various things are in those across each of those indicators. So we put all of those indicators on the wall, and we had everyone identify what you could measure that would get to consumer value, for example, or marketing, or cost of production, or environmental regulation, or access to capital. And we asked, what's the measurable utility, which is over on the far left, is how easy is it to measure and how valuable is the measure. Some things are really easy to measure, but they're not very valuable. It kind of goes into a medium. Some things are incredibly valuable, very hard to measure. That goes into a medium. Some things are really hard to measure and not very valuable. That's a low utility. The high, oops. Sorry about that. Not sure what that was. The high utility is, of course, the that's where the sweet spot is. That's where it has high value and it's easy to measure. So that's what we're trying to get at. This is an ongoing discussion. This is where we ended up. So we did the same for the social dimensions of sustainability. You should all have access to these. They're also in the report. And for the environmental dimensions of sustainability. And what this represents is the first draft of what a suite of key performance indicators, priority key performance indicators, should look like for this body. The next question is, how do you measure them? What are the metrics? And this starts to imply what those metrics should look like too. We did not get that far, and that's by design. Some of this stuff has to simmer a little bit, and we need more people in the room to have this discussion. The danger of moving too fast is that you only have the 52 people in the room making all the decisions. Maybe we needed 54 in the room, and those 2 people who are missing are critical because they represented a perspective that otherwise isn't there. So there's a necessary iteration that goes in this sort of deliberation as well, and we are in that process now. We also were tasked with starting to define things like, aquaculture is a big, complex production category. What are aquaculture producers? So we looked at food, sports, bait, and ornamental fish, and we're using USDA's and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services categories here. And so we, across those 4 categories of fish production, we have species. Now there are on the bottom of all those you see other, because
Muted.
List of the big ones. So I don't think I was doing that. Can you? I'm making sure you guys can hear me okay. Maybe I was rolling my. Anyways, then crustaceans. We evaluated crustaceans, mollusks, plants, and miscellaneous. And finally, there are a range of production strategies: salinity, water salinity, marine brackish, fresh, thermal regimes, management strategies, and treatment approaches. So this is the sort of framework we're looking at for production, for analyzing the various priorities across aquaculture. It's not comprehensive, but it's pretty thorough. There are always going to be other categories that are going to require special consideration, but in general, this captures the range of production in the United States. So our next steps to review and revise the top 5 priorities. We need to evaluate production category specific priorities, because some of those priorities are going to shift based upon the species you produce, the region you produce in, your production management criteria. It's necessary that we pilot the process of benchmarking assessment with a leading producer category. That's my experience with other ag sectors, is that you don't learn anything until you do it. So it's time to start benchmarking. That means we need to identify and partner with a leading producer category or a leading producer organization in order to evaluate what this looks like in the next steps. Finally, it's important that we get more growers and more customers, retailers, restaurants, etc., in the room for this process to have legitimacy. We need more NGOs in the room too. We had 2, but we probably need 6 or 7 in the room if we're going to have 50 people. 10% representation by NGOs is probably a pretty minimum. We need probably more than that. So those are the sorts of iterative improvements we need to make. That is, let's see, it is now 5:20 or 3:21 in Central Time, and that concludes my presentation. I'm happy at this point to address questions. If you have them, I would encourage you to text them on the chat or let Jessica know, and I'll be happy to address your questions as we go. Jessica, can you hear me?
Yes, Marty. We haven't had any questions come in through the chat box yet. Let's see.
Oh, here's one.
Here you go. There's one for you.
How can we provide input at this point in the process? I would reach out to Katie Ambrose and Jessica Green at NIAA. If you have not received the documents, receive the documents, and you certainly can provide written comments. I think it's a wonderful way to do this. Review the documents, provide written comments, assessments, critiques to that document, to the summary of the previous work group outcomes, and that will inform the next group, next iteration, and then participate, because we all know that people who show up are the ones who make decisions. So be engaged with NIAA so you understand how and when and where you can participate in the next workshop. We will be having more workshops as we move forward in this process. So I think that's the easiest way to provide input. You can certainly reach out to me as well, mmatlock@uark.edu, fairly easy to find. And I'll be happy to answer questions or address issues as well. But the formal way is through the organization. All right, we have another question. Since this is not a third-party certification, who verifies the participants are doing what they indicate they're doing? It's a very good question. In the whole portfolio of sustainability protocols, certification is probably the most the lowest risk for the consumer or the customer, because there's a third party that asserts that in fact claims are being that validates claims. However, it's also the most expensive to implement, because somebody has to pay for the certification process, and somebody has to pay for the development of the process, and someone has to pay for the implementation. So that's one side. On the other side, you have sort of the broad voluntary compliance with best practices strategy, which I'd say is pretty much where we are across most agriculture now. Where we are, what we're looking at in the middle is moving towards engaging producers at sector level to say, this is our best possible practice. These are our goals as a group, and we should be moving forward to asserting those goals. Now, what you have to do is have a third-party organization, institution, assess whether you as a group are making progress towards those goals by your collective practices. So you're not certifying John Smith's catfish farm, but you could make claims based upon this category-wide U.S. catfish production assessment, for example. Benchmark all U.S. catfish production in total and set goals, and then assess production across all producers and evaluate how you're doing and if you're making progress moving those goals. So that becomes a sector level certification of sorts. And that's really where most ag producers that I work with are going, because the power in the collective is that it distributes the cost, but also it distributes the benefits. It makes it pre-competitive. All catfish farmers want to do better, as opposed to one catfish farmer doing better and not telling anyone else how to do it because it's a competitive issue. Now it's everybody is invested in everybody getting better. Sustainability is not about having 10% of the world doing the best. It's about all the people in the world doing better economically, doing better socially, doing better environmentally. And so that's what this goal is. It's a collective action by sector for continuous improvement. So I hope I answered that question on certification. All right. Let's see. I've got a couple of questions that are coming in pretty good now. Let's see. We want to know who is here. Please identify yourself with name and organization in the chat log. That's a good idea. Why don't we hold off on that? We'll do that towards the end, because that it will blind me to because every log that comes in I lose track. And so the other thing we can do is Jessica can distribute a participation list. We know everyone who's online because you had to sign in, and it's public, so we can distribute that to everyone. Jessica, is that okay?
Yeah, that works.
So you will all get a list of participants at the end of this process. How's that? What value does this bring to a producer versus certification program that their buyer are asking for? Very good question. It goes back to the question of certification. The fact is, a buyer can use a sector level certification to make claims and meet their goals. And I would argue, and this goes to the next question, which is this can be a race to the bottom where only a few goals need to be met, where a third party addresses a broader suite of metrics and could be more rigorous. What I would argue is that when you have, in my experience, and it's not just my experience, the scientific community's assessment of certification protocols, whether it's Rainforest Alliance or Fair Trade Association or any of these other certification protocols, They're very good at moving certain metrics. But what they also do is they tend to disadvantage the smaller producers. They tend to disadvantage the producers, especially if we're talking global, who are less technologically connected. Certainly they disadvantage the smaller producers because the cost of certification and the cost of compliance can be high. Now you might argue, well, that's the whole point, is to get everyone to comply. Yes and no. Yes, it is the whole point, but it doesn't work. What you end up with is ultimately, in most cases, unless it's a regulation, you end up with a few certified bodies who do very well and everybody else not. And since people aren't certified, they're not participating, they're not engaged in continuous improvement, and it doesn't make things better except for those few who are certified. But rarely is the certification valuable enough, unless it's a threshold, unless it's a regulation, a barrier to entry of a market. It does not actually make things better across the board. What I expect to see is a whole portfolio of these sorts of initiatives where you have base level participation in a sector program, and if your market, if your customer, whoever the customer is, a greenbelt restaurant chain, whoever wants something more for their own purposes, then that's between the producer and their customer to negotiate and make profit off of. But to do this for a whole sector, that's where it becomes onerous on all the producers, and that's where the pushback has been. And the other challenge is, what about 35 certification programs? Which one's the best? Which one do you participate in, and how do you avoid just confusing the customer, which is what also happens. So the advantage of this approach is it is sector-wide. When I say sector, we talked about those at the end of the presentation, all catfish, all crustaceans, et cetera, or all shrimp producers, maybe even regional. And you focus on the problems you have. If it's catfish in the south, maybe it's water quality, and maybe it's fish quality, and maybe, or whatever those issues are. Those key performance indicators, the way you avoid the race to the bottom is that the producers don't just develop those key performance indicators in a vacuum. They develop those with the stakeholders who care. The conservation organizations, their customers, the regulatory organizations, so they know what we're up to, so there's no confusion or worse, contradicting policies. Other producers, so that you have the efficiency of learning from each other and the effectiveness of a single process. It doesn't mean that that others can't engage in other certification programs. It's a free market of ideas and competition. Let that work. But at the baseline, what this represents really is the model that NRCS started with in 1930 with the Soil Conservation Service and trying to reduce soil erosion, where you work across all sectors in a pre-competitive way to try to identify priorities and move things along to make things better. So I hope I've answered that question. I'm certainly happy to follow up with that if we need to. How is this different than existing certification programs? If it's sector-wide, why the species sectors, specific sector is not on board? Because we're just getting started for the second part of that question. Because the species sectors are, there's a lot of groups, a lot of organizations, and frankly a lot of fear about certification in aquaculture and all agriculture. There's a lot of pressure, and folks are afraid that this is just yet another, and no one needs another headache. No one needs another cost of doing business that doesn't make them more money or improve their production success on the producer side. And customers don't want yet another competing certification protocol that they have to pay for, but doesn't make their products more stable, secure, or safe. And so what we're trying to do is break through that noise, and that's where industry-wide collaboration makes this more powerful. The way this is often working, and will work with poultry and with other organizations, is you have an industry-wide protocol, and then the various sectors can pick this up if they choose or not, if they choose not to. If it doesn't make sense economically, ecologically, socially, don't do it. But at least there's a framework that is possible that doesn't exist right now. Let's see, won't this just add to the confusion of the alphabet soup of certification? Yes, if we're not careful. And the way we do this isn't a certification, this is U.S. aquaculture writ large engaged in explicit continuous improvement through stakeholder engagement. This is the industry taking control of its destiny to ensure that the industry and its partners, the NGOs, the conservation organizations, as well as the customers, have a voice in what is the best desirable outcome. That's the key to avoiding the confusion that we've seen across all other ag sectors. This is working fairly well in field to market. I'm going to go back up in my slides, if I can, to the field to market slide, which I think is slide number 3 for those of you following along at home. And I want you to see who's in field to market. You'll notice Unilever's in field to market, Walmart, Kellogg's. There are a lot of people who buy a lot of stuff who are in field to market, and they are working with National Soybean Board, National Corn Growers Association, Indiana Soybean Alliance, Cotton Incorporated, etc., to identify practices that work for them. And World Wildlife Fund, Conservation International, Nature Conservancy, and others are also in the room to make sure that that process, that the claims that have come from that process are legitimate. So that's what gives this whole process authority as a sector-wide initiative. So this is fairly much the model I'm talking about for aquaculture. The beauty of this is if you don't like it, you don't have to do it. It's purely voluntary. If it doesn't work for you, don't do it. I think it's a fundamental rule of business, right? If it doesn't work, don't do it. There is one last question hanging out there. If it's not clear to me why we need another process, because we currently don't have a process for the industry. What we have are competitive branding processes, potentially, that create, except for the wild-caught marine industry does, but the aquaculture industry writ large does not, especially in the U.S. There are a couple of global certification protocols that this process could enhance. If you wanted to be part of some of the global certification protocols, this process could reduce your cost of engagement because you would have data that you won't otherwise have. Do we have any other questions, Jessica?
I believe that you've covered them all. Did you get what value does this process bring to a producer versus a certification program?
Yes, I hope I did.
Okay.
That's one that's always worth revisiting because I can answer that 5 times and still it's a question, because it is the foundational question. Why do it? The values it brings is it's not pitting one producer against another. This is a collaboration across all producers in a sector for continuous improvement of that sector. This is not saying that Mississippi catfish is more sustainable than Louisiana catfish. This is saying that all U.S. catfish meets these criteria for improved metrics for becoming more sustainable. And that means that if there is a competitive angle here, it's those who are in versus those who aren't. And so if you have a sector-wide process, those who are participating in that process are inherently engaged. Now that leads to that other question, that what about the race to the bottom? Well, that's where you have multiple stakeholders engaged to keep the process legitimate. So that's not just a lightweight claims without content or without substance process. If you make a claim, you have to have substantial verification that you're meeting that claim, but you don't have to do that at the farm level necessarily, or you can, but that's aggregated up. So it's not pitting one farmer against another, it's aggregated up for all farmers across the sector. And so you move the curve, everybody gets better. When everybody gets better, we all become more sustainable. I can't say that enough. When everybody gets better, we all become more sustainable. When only 10% of us get better, those 10% are more sustainable and the rest of us are sitting where we were sitting before. And that doesn't make things better down the road. Certainly does not improve the world. Ultimately, we are facing challenges globally we need to address. What steps to get more producers involved? There do not seem to be many involved. I think it's a very good question. This is part of the process. Recruitment through engagement. That seems to be, it's a constant challenge. We have to be engaging more people all the time. People don't, my experience, I've been involved in, as you've seen, dozens of these. My experience is that people get involved when there's something to get involved with. No one wants to get involved at the beginning of these things because it's so much time and effort and everyone's busy and there's very little way to tell what's going to be a winner or a loser in this process. So usually what happens in field to market, we went along for 4 years building a core community of participants before we got traction largely. But once we got traction, we went to, again, in the last 5 years, this organization now has over 200 members, and it's international now. And that's because the process we're using is transparent, and people see it as legitimate. So that's what I see happening here as an opportunity. Do you have data from the terrestrial program showing that there is overall improvement? Yes. In fact, that's what the universities are engaged in. This is where the scholarship comes into play. This is why universities do this, because the data analysis documenting improvement is good scholarship. We can publish that work in our professional journals, but also it's just good. It's good science. It's also good outreach. So we use a number of tools, life cycle assessment and others, to evaluate the impacts. Now, we have to evaluate what matters. That's where the key performance indicators start. So until we know what matters to you, we don't know what to evaluate. We could make a guess and probably get most of them right, but that's not a legitimate process either. We want you, the producers, I'm talking to the producers now, and then you, the stakeholders, that's everyone on the phone, to have a voice in what matters, and then the academics or consultants or whatever path you want to choose, but I recommend academics. We're frankly cheaper than consultants in most cases, can do the hard work of evaluating improvement, benchmarking, and then evaluating improvement. We just started a project with U.S. Poultry and Egg Federation where we are evaluating greenhouse gas, water, land use, and energy use from 1960s production practices to 2010 production practices, a 50-year retrospective. We're asking, where did we get better, where did we not get better, and how much better can we get across those 4 key performance indicators for poultry. That's an example of how that process works. So I hope I answered that question. The data were pretty robust. The next steps are on the screen now. We really need to have, if you're interested in participating, by all means engage with Katie. We need to start scheduling our next meeting. Do we have the next meeting scheduled yet, Katie? Or Jessica?
Not that I know of. Let me see if I can get her unmuted. Or Katie, if you could type that into the chat log.
So I think the main thing is to let them know you want to be involved in the next steps. Let Katie and Jessica know that you want to be involved in the next steps. And then we will reach out to you and we will coordinate for the next workshop. And the next workshop is when we start to evaluate how to prioritize. Also, we really need partners in benchmarking, and we need to evaluate where the improvements are. Because just next question, should technology transfer among producers be part of the common framework for sustainability in aquaculture? Absolutely. One of the best motivators for technology transfer between producers is when we all win. When one producer can share his or her successes with another and we all win. One of the biggest impediments is when those technology improvements are competitive advantages over your neighbor. Then why would you share? Why would you give your neighbor, your competitor, your advantage? So what we do acknowledge that some technological advantages are proprietary, but there are some things that are common that we all need to learn from each other and we all need to benefit from. And that's why we started doing this with row crop agriculture too, because the same sort of competition, as you all know, exists across all business sectors, and agriculture is first and foremost, it's a lifestyle, but it's also a business. And those engaged in the business practices are very cagey businessmen and women. They know how to make a profit or they wouldn't be in business anymore. They would not be sustainable. So the key is to make sure that we have a motivation for sharing successes, successful technologies and practices. And this is one way to move us in that direction. Certification programs that pit farmer against farmer kill this sort of technology transfer. There's no reason to share, because if you do, you're just giving your competitor your advantage. And that, I think, is a failed process. It's an antiquated process, and I do not think personally or professionally it is justified anymore. I think I've covered all of them. we'll give it another minute. If we do not have any other questions in the next minute or so, it is about 3:42.